There's little doubt the pandemic and the prolonged closing of schools have resulted in serious learning loss, but there's still debate over the value of measuring the losses with standardized testing or even how testing fits into the timetable for educational recovery. Our guest is from an organization that strongly supports the testing, even as a leverage for underserved communities. We'd like to welcome the president of the National Parents Union, Keri Rodrigues. Thank you very much for being with us, Keri.
So nice to be with you again, Chris.
Keri, I know you can speak organizationally about this, but what about speaking from your life experience during the pandemic, your own struggles with education? What have you learned from that?
Well, I can tell you, I have 5 little boys, so this is very real and very close to me. And I've watched them struggle throughout the past 13 months since the shutdown occurred. And frankly, as a mama, I'm very worried about whether or not any learning has occurred at all. Watching this kind of play out in my living room with our kids, it's been heartbreaking to see the lack of engagement, the lack of rigorous curriculum being offered, and frankly, the lack of social and emotional connection that our kids have been getting. So that's why I think it's really important. If my child, any of them, was sick physically, I'd want to take them to the doctor. I'd use a thermometer. I want to know how to measure how healthy or how sick my child is. And to do that, I've got to run him through some tests to see, whether or not he's got a fever, how much medicine to give, how bad the problem is. It's the same thing that we need to start doing in education, especially if we want to have an equity infused educational recovery. I want to know where my child is academically. How bad is the problem? Some of our children have actually thrived in these situations, free from distraction and some of the social situations that have made them uncomfortable and unable to access learning. But some of our kids have really had major problems accessing any kind of academics. So as parents, we want to know what our kids need, where are they right now, what we need to do to support them so that we don't have long-term implications coming out of this situation.
Well, the debate so far isn't necessarily between, full return to MCAS testing and zero MCAS testing. There is a position of the Mass Association of School Superintendents, and they're saying we don't want to have MCAS as we've known it so far, but we do support some kind of testing, especially if it's localized and diagnostic. What's wrong with that?
I don't think there's any problem with that. And, we're not trying to be unreasonable here, but we're also dealing with folks that, often are the chicken littles of education. The sky is always falling. Everything's impossible. We just can't do that. Well, during the pandemic, everything we thought was impossible has now become possible. From making sure that kids have access to technology, to making sure we have Wi-Fi in many areas that never did, not saying that that's perfect at this point, to offering virtual education, all of these things that we were told we just can't do. On top of the fact that we've also told parents and families that they have some right to make some decisions in terms of how their kids engage, when they engage, all of these things, all things that, frankly, the superintendents, the school committees, the teachers have told us, oh, no, we just can't do that. It's impossible. So when it comes to MCAS, when they come back again and they say, oh my gosh, this is impossible, we just can't do it, it's too hard. I mean, I was a part of the conversations when we were trying to discuss the evolution of MCAS and bringing into a new form. Oh, we can't do that because we don't have the technology, we don't have the computers. Well, now we're in a situation where everybody has computers. We can adapt, we can pivot, we can move. We've shown that we can do it. We need to do it now because the priority needs to be assessing where an incredible amount of resources that are flooding into districts from the federal government, from the state government, actually need to go so that they can actually impact our kids most effectively in the classroom. If we don't know where the problems are, we can't make sure the money actually gets to where the problems need to be addressed.
Well, one of the things I suppose you need to do if you want to get this kind of testing right away is that you have students who have equipment at home for remote learning, but before you give the test, don't you have to vet that equipment, make sure it's all working?
Yeah, I mean, this is not going to be perfect. Nobody has the illusion that this is going to be without its issues and flaws. But frankly, the fact of the matter is we're a year into the pandemic and remote learning. If you don't know whether or not a child has access to a laptop and technology a year in, then we've got a much bigger problem than just the MCAS. You haven't been doing your job to make sure that these kids have been served. Where have you been for the last year? So the fact of the matter is, we really need to, instead of trying to use MCAS as, this fear tactic and a weapon against children and saying, oh my gosh, this is going to be terrible. It's like what I tell my own kids. When my Matthew was in the 3rd grade and was taking the MCAS for the first time, I just said, hey, bud, you're taking MCAS tomorrow. What do you think? And Chris, I'll tell you, his shoulders hit his earlobes because he was terrified. Because we have we've weaponized the MCAS to the point where kids are afraid of it. And what I said to him is, Matthew, this is not a tool. You're not going to get in trouble. This is information that mommy needs to make sure you're learning what you need to learn, that the teacher is teaching effectively if she needs some help, and if your school needs some help. We can't do any of those things if we don't check to see where you are. So what we need to do, honestly, is cool down a lot of the rhetoric, use this as information we need to fix the system, to make sure resources are allocated so we can help our kids. And frankly, we've taken accountability off the table. We can have that conversation for another day because, a lot of these districts and even teachers don't like hearing feedback that they don't want to hear if maybe what they're doing is not effective. What we got to do is put kids first. They've got to recover from this, and we can't help them by just putting our head in the sand and saying, well, we don't want to know what the problem is.
Well, if you go back to a little more than a year ago, the State Department of Education said that what Boston schools are doing, the district schools, at least generally speaking, is not effective. We've had MCAS for more than a full decade. So how can we say that MCAS has helped improve things that much?
Well, it's helped to identify the problem. I mean, just because we don't assess or we don't run a test, like the test itself is not the problem. The test reveals the problem. The test reveals the inequities. Like, we've always suspected that there have been major problems with Boston public schools, but until we have data to say, oh my gosh, it's really bad here, we cannot hold the system accountable. And frankly, we can't address what's happening. What I'd like to see is us use that data more effectively, because I'll tell you something, we've had chronic issues at the King Elementary School, while things have vastly improved at the Elliott School, 2 different parts of Boston. So now we know where those inequities lie. So maybe the Elliott School might be over-resourced, or maybe they're getting the right amount of resources. So maybe that informs us that maybe if the kids at the King are not doing as well, we should reallocate some resources so that they're at the same level as the Elliott, and we're going to watch those MCAS scores rise.
You get some socioeconomic differences in the school population too, don't you, between those 2 schools?
Yeah, well, there are socioeconomic differences, but talent is equitably distributed. It's access to opportunity and resources that are not. You can't tell me that the kids at the King Elementary School are less talented than the kids at the Elliott School. It's just that the kids at the Elliott School have better access to resources than the kids at the King. So what we need to do is look at building level expenditures. How much money does it take to get a kid at the Elliott School to achieve those levels of MCAS, where we're seeing at the King, with this allocation of resources, we're only getting this far with MCAS. And when we take a look at that and we're able to hold the system accountable for the inequity of resources, it's not, we cannot continue to indict parents and families for living in a cycle of poverty, which we're helping to create through our education system.
Well, I think, as you're well aware, recovery is going to take more than just poring over the data from an exam. You've asked parents, or maybe you've seen polls of what parents want, especially about the idea of maybe being allowed to repeat a year. What are you hearing out there?
So I have done extensive polling. We were doing polling on a weekly basis back in March. We now do it on a monthly basis where we ask parents these exact questions. Now, when it comes to repeating the year, about 70% of parents say that they want that as an option. Now, when you talk to education policy experts, they say that may not be the best idea socially and emotionally. But other things that parents are really interested in include 86% of parents being very interested in having individualized education plans, similar to what we see in the special education system, where we need data from MCAS that tells you exactly where the child is academically. So you convene your team of educators who are working with your child every single day to say, this is where Matthew is right now. This is where we want him to get. These are the supports in how he's going to need to access education to get him where we need to go. 86% of parents want that kind of individualized information and that kind of planning from the education system. And that's what we see in the special education sphere. We'd like to bring it to general ed. In addition, we'd like to see expanded summer learning, which polls extraordinarily well, over 80%. We'd also like to see an earlier start to the school year with 30 or 40 hours of direct math and ELA instruction. When you ask parents, what are you concerned about most when it comes to academics? Where do you think your kid's really falling behind and what are you really worried about? It's math, it's English, then it's science. So what they're looking for is making up for some of that time spent on learning, those precious minutes that we lost during the pandemic, by taking a look at how do we start the school year earlier? How do we change the hours of the school day? So maybe we add an extra hour to the end so your child's getting that direct one-on-one instruction where they need to catch up. But unless we have a diagnostic tool that says, okay, we have 40% of kids that are going to need additional math instruction, we don't know to allocate those resources to make sure that those funds are available so that that actually happens. We need this data. We can't move forward without it.
Thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Nice to see you.
Good to see you again, too. Keri Rodrigues from the National Parents Union. We'll have more news in just a moment.